Power usually gets what it wants. Fear does most of the negotiating before a single word is spoken. So what happens when the most dangerous man in Manhattan gets completely ignored by the one woman in the room who was never trying to be seen? Cruelty is common in rooms like this. A bruised ego is rare. This is how 30 seconds of being overlooked turned into an obsession that would take down an empire. Chandelier lights spilled gold across the walls of the Ashcroft Foundation Gala, fracturing over paintings worth more than most people's houses. The air was thick with champagne, old perfume, and the particular hum of people pretending not to check who else was in the room. For Ava Kensington, it was just another night she had to survive in a dress that cost more than her rent and a room full of people who'd already decided what she was worth before she opened her mouth. Ava was not the typical Ashcroft clientele. 27, curvy, unbothered on the outside in a way that made people who weren't unbothered visibly uncomfortable. She wore an emerald gown that clung to every curve she'd stopped apologizing for years ago, her dark hair loose over one shoulder, a leather folder pressed to her chest like the only thing standing between her and the room's opinion of her. She knew she looked good. She also knew that in a room like this, looking good and being seen as worthy were two entirely different transactions, and she wasn't in the mood to pay for either one tonight. She was there to present a valuation report. That was it. That was the whole night as far as she was concerned. She really thinks she fits in this world? Marcus Hale said it loud enough to carry, swirling his champagne, eyes crawling over her curves like she was a joke he'd been saving all night. Look at those curves, almost embarrassing. Laughter rippled through the crowd, soft and ugly. Ava's grip tightened on the folder, her hands shook, her eyes did not. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a tired, familiar voice was already doing the math on how many more rooms like this one she'd have to survive before people stopped laughing. She thought about walking out. She thought about it for exactly 1 second, and then she planted her heels a little firmer into the marble instead. Funny thing about humiliation. The body panics a full beat before the mind decides what to do about it. What looks like weakness in that first shaking second is usually just courage, running a little behind schedule. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the entire room forgot how to breathe. Security parted like water. The event coordinator dropped her clipboard mid-sentence. Every head turned at once, and the laughter died somewhere in the back of 100 throats, because Lucien Voss had just walked in. 33 years old, built like something carved out of cold marble and left out in the winter too long. Black bespoke suit, no color anywhere on him. The temperature of the room actually seemed to drop. Even the string quartet lost the beat for half a measure. Marcus went pale and swallowed whatever he'd been about to say next. Ava didn't notice any of it. She was too busy steadying a waiter who'd nearly dropped a tray of glasses. In the process, her shoulder brushed against Lucien's arm, and she didn't even register who he was. Her eyes were on the waiter's watch. A flaw in the engraving, old Italian craftsmanship deliberately done wrong, the kind of imperfection no real jeweler would let out of a workshop. She'd seen that exact pattern before, buried in a file 5 years old that had crossed her desk for one afternoon before someone above her pay grade quietly closed it. That watch wasn't jewelry, it was a listening device. Someone had wired a member of the Voss family's own staff, and whoever was on the other end of it was hearing everything said in this room tonight. She filed it away, said nothing, and kept moving. Walked straight past the most dangerous man in New York like he was a coat rack. He stopped mid-step. His brow came down, and something dark and amused pulled at the corner of his mouth. Men like him spend their whole lives being feared, flattered, and calculated around. So when a woman walks past him without so much as a flicker of recognition, it doesn't read as rude. It reads as the first honest thing he's encountered in years. "That one," he said quietly to the man beside him. "Bring her to me." 30 seconds of being ignored. That's all it took for Ava Kensington to make a mafia boss decide that the woman the whole room had just tried to erase might be the one person who could either save his empire or burn it to the ground. And neither of them knew yet that she'd already found his spy. If you were Ava, would you have kept walking or turned around the second you found out who he was? Tell us below, because what happens next only happens because she didn't turn around. Monday morning, the humiliation followed her to work. The private bank where colleagues who used to nod at her in the elevator now looked straight through her, like her body made her invisible in a way her mind never could. She caught her reflection in the elevator's brushed steel doors on the way up, chin lifted, shoulders back, the posture of someone pretending they hadn't spent Saturday night crying into a bowl of leftover pasta, the container still sitting unwashed in her sink because she hadn't had the energy to deal with it. She'd promised herself she wouldn't let it get to her. She was failing at that promise slowly, quietly, in the space between meetings, in the extra few seconds she spent staring at her closet each morning, wondering if today was a day she could survive being looked at. Only Elena Reyes still pulled a chair up to her desk. "You okay?" Elena slid a coffee across, her eyes doing a quick, worried sweep of Ava's face. The kind of look best friends give when they already know the answer and are asking anyway, just to give the other person a chance to say it out loud. "I flagged something in the Ashcroft report." Ava didn't look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on the numbers scrolling across her monitor, because looking at numbers was easier than looking at Elena's face right now, easier than admitting how much smaller she still felt than she wanted to. 3 shell companies, a provenance certificate that doesn't match the auction records. Elena's eyebrows shot up. "Ava, that's not nothing." "No," quiet. "It's not." Same old pattern for her. Bury the pain in precision. Turn a humiliating weekend into a spreadsheet she could actually control. There was a kind of relief in it, the way the numbers never laughed at her, never looked at her body before they looked at her mind, never made her feel like she had to apologize for existing in a room. People who feel unseen get very, very good at seeing everything else instead. It's a survival skill dressed up as a talent, sharpened in rooms where nobody ever looked at them long enough to notice anything else. That evening, a courier delivered a thick cream envelope, wax seal and all, the kind of paper that felt heavier in her hands than it should have. An invitation from Lucien Voss, a private viewing of his art collection. Elena's eyes went wide when she saw the seal, her mouth already halfway open with questions. Ava just felt a cold thread pulled tight in her stomach. That particular unease that comes from being wanted by someone you don't yet understand. "You're going, right?" Elena asked, already reaching for her phone like she needed to text someone the news immediately. "I don't know," Ava admitted, turning the envelope over in her hands, feeling the wax seal under her thumb, the raised crest of it pressing into her skin. Some part of her wanted to say no, wanted to protect whatever fragile calm she'd built back up since Saturday. But another part of her, the part that had spent 5 years chasing a case file nobody else believed mattered, wanted answers more than she wanted safety. She went. The penthouse was gold light and glass walls, the city spread out below like something for sale, the kind of view that made her feel very small and very aware of the shoes she'd chosen, suddenly wondering if they were expensive enough for a room like this. The elevator ride up alone had taken almost a full minute, and by the time the doors opened, her palms were damp inside the thin silk of her gloves. Ava moved past the paintings with a practiced eye, her fingers itching slightly the way they always did around art she suspected was lying to her. Until she found it. A side contract tucked under loose paperwork, a signature that didn't match the rest of the file. "You found it faster than my lawyers did," Lucien said, appearing behind her with 2 glasses of wine, his voice low enough that it seemed to belong only to the room, not to anyone who might be listening. She took the glass, swirled it once, watching the way the light caught the deep red of it, the smell of dark cherry and oak rising toward her. Poured it straight into a ceramic vase without a flicker of hesitation. His face didn't move. His eyes did. A flicker of something sharp and assessing, the look of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the person standing in front of him. "Bitter under the tannins," she said, setting the glass down with a small, deliberate click against the marble. "A mild sedative. Somebody wants you asleep tonight." Silence stretched, thick enough that Ava could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, wondering for one uneasy second if she'd just made a very dangerous mistake by showing her hand so plainly in a penthouse 30 floors above a city that would never even hear her scream. Then he laughed, short, low, like it surprised even him, a sound that seemed to catch in his throat before it found its way out. "Most people are afraid of me." "I'm not afraid of you," Ava said, meeting his eyes now, steady. "I'm afraid of people I can't predict." "And you predicted the wine." "I predicted the man who poured it." He looked at her a long moment, something unfamiliar behind those gray eyes, not calculation this time. Want, and something quieter beneath it, something that looked almost like relief. Power like his usually pulls people who perform bravery they don't feel, or fear they think he wants to see. Ava gave him neither. That's what got under his skin, worked its way past the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. "I haven't met someone who wasn't afraid of me in a very long time." "Maybe they were afraid of the wrong thing," Ava said, and something about the way she said it, half question, half challenge, made his mouth curve again, that same dark amusement from the gala flickering back to life. That night, alone, Ava unpinned her hair and studied herself in the mirror, Marcus's laughter still rattling around behind her ribs, mixing now with the sound of Lucien's voice, the two of them tangled together in a way she didn't fully understand yet. She ran her hands over the curve of her own hips, the same body that had been mocked in front of 100 strangers just days ago, and for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, she didn't look away from her own reflection. She noticed, almost with surprise, that her shoulders had unclenched slightly, that the tight coil of tension she'd been carrying all week had loosened just a fraction. On the dresser sat a velvet box she hadn't noticed walking in. Inside, a diamond pin shaped like a hawk, cold and perfect against dark velvet. A note, handwriting sharp as a blade. "Your curves were the finest artwork in that room tonight." She sat with it a long time, turning the pin over in her fingers, feeling its weight settle into her palm, the metal cool against her skin even as her face grew warm. Something in her chest loosened. Not all the way, just enough. Just enough to let her breathe a little easier that night, to let her sleep without replaying Marcus's words on a loop behind her closed eyes. Healing rarely comes as one big moment. Usually it's just one small piece of proof that the story you'd been telling yourself was never true, arriving quietly, in a velvet box, at the exact moment you needed it most. Later, Lucien told his second-in-command he'd known about Ava for 5 years. A fraud case that crossed paths with the family, never quite closed, a loose thread he'd kept tucked away in the back of his mind for half a decade without ever quite understanding why. He thought he was the one running this game. He wasn't. Ava had just flipped a card even he hadn't seen coming, and somewhere close to home, something far more dangerous than a forged contract was already starting to move, quietly, in the dark, where even a man like Lucien Voss couldn't yet see it. Next gala. Same city, different room, but the air felt just as heavy with old money and old cruelty. The moment Ava stepped through the doors, she felt the same prickling awareness crawl up the back of her neck, the same sense of being catalogued and dismissed before she'd even said a word. Marcus tried it again, louder, playing to a bigger room, his voice carrying that same practiced arrogance he'd worn like cologne his entire adult life. The old shame climbed right back up Ava's throat, familiar and sour, and for one terrible second she felt 27 years old and small again, exactly the way she'd felt the last time. Her hands found the edge of the podium and gripped it hard enough that her knuckles went pale. Then Lucien stepped forward, voice flat, absolute, carrying easily across a room that had gone dead silent the moment he moved. She's the only person here who can't be bought by appearance. The room went so quiet it felt like everyone forgot to breathe at once. Glasses frozen halfway to mouths, 100 pairs of eyes swinging between Lucien and Ava like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which way the power would break. Somewhere near the back, a woman's champagne flute tilted dangerously in her forgotten grip. A keycard slipped from Marcus's pocket, hit the marble floor with a small, sharp sound that seemed enormous in the silence. Ava bent down for it, her heart hammering, and in the same motion, laid out exactly how Marcus had used a forged painting to skim money from his own charity gala. Her voice, when it came, didn't shake at all. A fact that surprised even her, a small, private victory she'd carry long after this night ended. This piece was never authenticated. She held the keycard up, then set it down deliberately on the nearest table, like evidence at a trial. The records were altered. That money never reached the children's fund it was supposed to. Marcus went from red to white in about 3 seconds, his mouth opening and closing without finding any words, the same mouth that had mocked her curves days earlier, now working uselessly around nothing at all. I've spent my whole career being told I don't fit in rooms like this one. She straightened up, feeling something settle into place in her spine, a kind of certainty she hadn't known she had until this exact moment. But I know exactly what belongs here, and what doesn't. There's a moment when someone who's been humiliated in public stops absorbing the room's judgment and starts naming it out loud instead. That's rarely about anger. It's someone finally trusting their own competence more than they fear what people think. A shift so small on the outside and so enormous on the inside that the person going through it barely recognizes themselves on the other side of it. Lucien finished him off with one sentence, quiet and final, the kind of sentence that ends careers instead of arguments. Then he did something nobody expected. He crouched down and gathered Ava's scattered papers off the floor himself, in front of 500 people, his movements unhurried, deliberate, like he wanted every single person in that room to watch him do it. A Mafia boss on his knees for the woman they'd mocked days earlier. Somewhere behind her, Ava heard a woman gasp softly, the sound of someone's entire understanding of the world quietly rearranging itself. "I'm protecting what's valuable," he said, standing back up, holding her papers out to her with both hands, his eyes never leaving hers. There's a difference. For a man who'd spent his whole life mistaking control for love, that sentence was as close to a confession as he knew how to give. Respect first. Always respect first. It's the only language he trusted, the only currency he'd ever known how to spend honestly. The antique watch on his own wrist caught the light as he straightened his cuff. Same flaw she'd spotted on the waiter days before. Not decoration, a family mark. Trust. And now, somehow, standing here with her papers back in her hands and the whole room watching, it marked her too. The room turned in her favor that night. She could feel it, the shift in the air, the way people's eyes lingered on her a beat longer, differently now, weighing something other than her waistline. But somewhere out of sight, in a room with drawn curtains and cigarette smoke curling toward a low ceiling, a rival syndicate had already clocked the shift in power, and forged evidence was already moving into position to take the whole collection by force. Marcus still thought he had some hold on her fate, some card left to play. He had no idea what door he'd just kicked open, or how quickly it was about to swing shut behind him. The betrayal came from inside. Victor Kane, Lucien's own right hand, the man who'd sat at his table for years, who'd been trusted with things Lucien had never told another living soul, planted a flash drive of falsified records, froze Ava's accounts overnight, the kind of silent violence that doesn't leave a mark but empties a person out just the same. Pointed federal investigators straight at her for money laundering. She sat in a freezing conference room, the air conditioning turned up too high, goosebumps rising along her arms, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling, while Lucien, in front of his own counsel, pulled away from her completely. I don't know her well enough to vouch for her. Flat, cold, delivered without so much as a flicker in his expression, and something in Ava's chest just cracked. A sound she swore she could almost hear. Like glass giving way under pressure it had been holding for too long. She stared at the table in front of her, at her own hands, refusing to let anyone in that room see her face crumble, even as everything in her wanted to. Her nails dug small crescents into her own palm, the only thing keeping the tremble in her jaw from becoming something worse. Cruel trick the mind plays on people who've already been hurt before. It doesn't need much evidence to believe the abandonment is happening again. The old wound's already done the convincing, has been rehearsing this exact betrayal for years, waiting patiently for a moment just like this one to prove itself right. What she didn't know, Lucien had already traced the fake files back to Victor days earlier, had sat with that knowledge alone in the dark of his study, turning it over like a blade he wasn't sure yet how to use. The distance in that conference room was an act, every cold word calculated and deliberate, and it cost him more to say than anyone in that room would ever know. Bait, to pull his enemy's focus away from the one person who could actually expose the truth. What looked like betrayal on the surface was, underneath, one of maybe 3 times in his life he'd put someone else's safety ahead of his own name. And it never once crossed his mind to tell her. Protecting her in his head didn't require her permission, a flaw in his thinking that would cost him more than he realized in the days that followed. Late that night, alone in her apartment with the lights off and her laptop screen the only light in the room, Ava went back through old email records, her eyes burning from staring at the screen for hours, her third cup of cold coffee forgotten on the counter. Found the pattern, confirmed Victor's betrayal, clean and complete, undeniable. Her hands were shaking again, but this time from something closer to grief than fear. Grief for the version of trust she'd allowed herself to feel in that penthouse weeks ago over a glass of poisoned wine. She sent the analysis to Lucien with no expectation he'd even open it, half convinced by then that it wouldn't matter either way, and then sat staring at her phone for a long, empty hour, waiting for a reply that didn't come. He did. And quietly, without a word to her, without so much as a phone call to explain himself, gave up a $50 million deal just to buy back the real evidence before anyone could use it against her. He sat alone that night in his study, with the papers spread across his desk, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the number didn't matter to him at all. She was handed a clean way out. A quiet phone call, an offer wrapped in careful, lawyerly language. Walk away, keep her freedom, no questions asked, no further involvement required. She sat with the offer for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling the pull of it, the simple relief of just disappearing from all of this, of going back to a life where nobody knew her name. She came back instead, walked into that council chamber with the proof that cleared her name and buried Victor's lie for good, her heels echoing against marble in a room full of men who'd have preferred she never showed up at all. Worth sitting with that for a second. Leaving was the smart move, the safe one. Nobody would have blamed her for taking it. She chose the truth over the exit anyway. That's the kind of quiet courage that never trends, never makes headlines, and changes everything anyway, usually without anyone but the person living it ever fully understanding what it cost. In front of the syndicate that came to tear his empire apart, Lucien made his choice plain. Stood beside her, not behind her. His hand found the small of her back for half a second, barely there, but she felt it, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight since that conference room finally let go. A curator Marcus had once waved off as nobody stood up and backed every word Ava said, her voice steady despite the fear plainly written across her face. The room that mocked her weeks ago started turning, slow but turning. Chairs creaking as people shifted, murmurs rising and falling like a tide changing direction. The betrayal nearly cost Lucien everything he'd built. Ava just proved, in front of everyone who mattered, that she was the only one who could save it. Marcus went down fast once the evidence hit the federal agents. Accounts frozen within the week. A reputation built on decades of fake charm gone in days. The same socialites who'd laughed at Ava now crossing the street to avoid being seen anywhere near him. At the closing gala, under lights warmer than the ones at that first humiliating presentation, Lucien pressed his family ring into Ava's hand, his fingers closing over hers for a moment longer than necessary. Numbers engraved inside, an account code tied straight to Marcus's fraud. Proof Lucien had been building this plan around her mind from the very start, long before either of them had admitted what was growing between them. In front of the same crowd that laughed at her once, Ava stood there, spine straight, chin lifted, unmistakably essential. And she let herself feel it this time, instead of shrinking away from it. He started asking her opinion before every big decision now, pulling out a chair for her at tables she once wouldn't have been allowed near. What began as danger and heat had settled into something steadier, something that felt less like a spark and more like a foundation. Partners. "You walked right past me without a second look," he told her, quiet, his voice low enough that it belonged only to the two of them, even in a room full of people. "Now I can't decide anything without you in the room." The people who'd mocked her body watched her move through those same halls now with a kind of authority nobody could argue with, their eyes following her the way they once followed only wealth or beauty, seeing her clearly for the first time. Justice, this time, didn't look like revenge. It just looked like her rising, while they stayed exactly where they'd always been, small and unchanged, watching someone they'd underestimated become impossible to ignore. Real justice rarely looks like punishment. Usually, it just looks like someone finally standing in light they were always capable of holding, while the people who tried to dim it are forced to watch, powerless to do anything but watch. "You changed how I understand power," Lucien said, his eyes steady on hers. "Used to think it meant control. Now I know it means trust." He killed a major auction, one that would have dragged Ava back into public scrutiny, back into rooms full of people ready to pick her apart again, just to protect her peace over the profit. A decision his lawyers argued against for hours, and one he never once reconsidered. The woman they once called invisible had become the one person this empire couldn't run without, and everyone in that room, whether they liked it or not, finally understood it. Alone, away from the crowd, in the quiet of his penthouse, with the city lights scattered below them like something out of a dream neither of them had quite believed they'd get to live in, Lucien finally told her everything. The gala noise still buzzed faintly somewhere below them, muffled through glass, a whole world of chandeliers and gossip going on without either of them. Up here, 30 floors above it, the air was different, cooler, quieter. Ava had kicked off her heels the moment the elevator doors closed behind them, and now she stood barefoot on the cold marble, a blanket loose around her shoulders, watching the way the wind moved through Lucien's dark hair as he stood at the railing with his back half turned to her, like he needed a second before he could say what he'd come up here to say.
I went cold in that meeting because I needed Victor to believe I doubted you.
His voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it, stripped of all its usual control, and for the first time since the night of the gala, she watched him struggle to hold a sentence together.
It was never true. Not for 1 second.
She didn't say anything right away. She let the silence sit there between them, let herself actually feel the weight of what he'd just admitted, instead of rushing to fill the space with forgiveness he hadn't fully earned yet. Her chest was tight, caught somewhere between relief and an old, stubborn ache that didn't dissolve just because the truth had finally arrived. "Do you know what that did to me?" she asked, quietly, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. "Sitting in that room.
Watching you look at me like I was nothing. I know."
He turned to face her fully now, and there was nothing guarded left in his expression, nothing performed. "I've replayed it every day since. I told myself it was the only way to protect you. I still believe that, but I know what it cost you to sit there and take it. You could have warned me." "I could have." He didn't try to defend it, didn't reach for an excuse. "I told myself you didn't need to carry that weight on top of everything else. I was wrong. I took the choice away from you, and you deserved better than that, especially from me." That honesty landed somewhere deep in her chest, softer than she expected. She'd spent her whole life being underestimated by people who never once apologized for it. Marcus never apologized. The socialites at that gala never apologized. And here was a man capable of freezing bank accounts and burying a rival's entire reputation in a matter of days, standing in front of her, admitting plainly that he'd been wrong. She found out something else, too, sitting with him on that balcony with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the night air. He'd used her very first report, months back, to kill a dangerous deal before it ever moved, quietly, without ever telling her, trusting her instincts before he'd even fully trusted her. "Wait!" She turned to look at him properly now, something shifting behind her eyes as the pieces started falling into place. "That deal that fell through in March, the shipping contracts, that was because of my report." "That was because of you," he said simply. "I read your analysis and canceled the whole arrangement within the hour. I never told you because at the time I didn't want you to know how much power your work already had over decisions you didn't even know you were part of." She sat with that for a long moment, feeling something almost dizzying settle over her. 5 years, longer than she'd realized. She'd been shaping the direction of an empire she hadn't even known she'd stepped into, one report at a time, one overlooked detail after another, long before a Mafia boss ever said her name out loud in a crowded ballroom. "You've been paying attention to me a lot longer than I knew," she said quietly. "I've been paying attention to you longer than I let myself admit," he said. And something in the way he said it made her chest ache in an entirely different way than it had all night. The wind picked up slightly, cool enough to make her pull the blanket tighter, and Lucien noticed, wordlessly closing the distance between them until he was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, even without touching. Neither of them said anything for a moment. It didn't feel like it needed saying. She walked beside him now, shoulders back, done shrinking to fit anyone else's idea of her. The wind caught the edge of her dress, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't think once about how she looked in it. She thought instead about how far she'd come from that first gala, the folder clutched to her chest like armor, the laughter she'd made herself stand through without flinching. She thought about the version of herself that had walked into that ballroom, certain she didn't belong, and she almost wanted to reach back through time and tell her she was wrong. That belonging was never the right question to be asking in the first place. He looked at her the way he'd never looked at anyone. Plain respect. Nothing performed, nothing calculated, nothing left over from the man who used to weigh every glance for advantage. His eyes moved over her face slowly, like he was memorizing something he intended to keep for a very long time. "I didn't make her queen," he said. "She always was."
Ava felt the words settle somewhere deep and quiet inside her, a place that had spent years bracing for the next insult, the next dismissive glance, the next room that decided her worth before she'd said a single word.
That place, for the first time in as long as she could remember, felt like it could finally rest. In a world full of masks, the one who dares to just be herself is the real treasure. She never needed to change to be loved. She only needed someone to actually see her. This story reminds us that your worth was never up to the cruel people in the room. Quiet women carry a kind of strength that can move empires. Love without respect was never love to begin with, and dignity, held quiet and steady, is its own kind of power. Sometimes the one everybody overlooks is the one who ends up changing everything. If Ava's story got to you, tell us in the comments what it meant to you. Like it, send it to someone who needs to hear it, and stick around for more stories about the ones nobody saw coming.